Scott in the system, and we are going to do our second installment with Liz Keegan from Fair Housing in West Michigan. And today's subjects will be on discrimination and how that affects seniors in relation to fair housing. Thank you for coming again.
Thank you so much for scheduling a second conversation and allowing us time to dive into this unique set of issues under fair housing. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And just in general, this is an issue that tends to come up more than not.
It can. We started looking at specific patterns of discrimination in senior housing more than 10 years ago. We were interested when the Kent County Senior Millage became funded, and we were thinking about what type of discrimination would be happening in senior housing that's specifically for people 55 and older or 62 and older. And we suspected that if we looked at it, we would find discrimination based on race, national origin, and presence of disability. So we actually did a pilot study or a testing investigation of senior communities, specifically here in Kent County, way back when, I think, in the late 2000s. And we discovered a higher rate of evidence for those protected classes. So seniors with disabilities, seniors of color, were more likely to experience housing discrimination when they were looking for specifically senior housing because of their race, because they had a physical or mental disability. And in fact, it was a 66% rate of evidence of discrimination in that special study, when generally at that time, when we were evaluating all housing opportunities, typically we would find evidence of discrimination about a third of the time. So when we were looking at senior housing, it was 66%, so much higher.
So yeah, I guess that would answer our first question I had, which was, what are the percentages of housing discrimination issues for seniors compared to other demographic groups?
Yes, and that's exactly what we were evaluating. And unfortunately, our hypothesis, we found evidence to support the fact that specifically seniors with physical or mental disabilities or seniors of different races and ethnicities were not as welcomed, or were maybe treated differently, or maybe flat out, discouraged from pursuing that senior housing opportunity. So we actually have been funded by the Kent County Senior Millage, which is administered here by the Area Agency on Aging of Western Michigan, for a number of years now, specifically looking at what does this look like. And we'll talk a lot more about that, I know, here today. But we've learned a lot about how important senior housing is. Essentially, when you're looking to move into senior housing, it may be one of the last times that you have to move or relocate. So it's a really important decision of, where do I want to spend the rest of my life? What sort of living do I need? What sort of senior community do I want? Are there services that I think I might need? Just making that decision and making those plans is a really important decision. So experiencing discrimination on top of that can make something that's already pretty challenging and emotional that much more difficult. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to kind of talk about more about what that looks like for our seniors.
Just based on your hypothesis there, it would be fair to say it was like about 30% in general, but when it came to seniors, it was about double that.
Right, specifically for seniors with disabilities or seniors of color.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to put that in perspective for our audience.
Right. I appreciate that. It's important to be aware that that shocked us. You know, if anything, we were expecting we would see about the same rate of evidence of discrimination, but for it to come in that much higher than our general investigations, which look at, for folks who are new to fair housing, I should say, you know, these laws prohibit discrimination in housing because of your race, your skin color, your religion, your national origin, your gender, whether or not you have kids, whether or not you have a physical or mental disability, whether or not you're married, what your age is, unless you're meeting those 2 age criteria standards that I mentioned earlier. We can have senior housing for 55 and older or 62 and older, but any other age restriction is going to be illegal in Michigan. So there's a lot of protections that say, you know, these are groups of people who need to be treated equally in their housing. And so for older adults, obviously we have the age protections, but we are seeing that they're being treated differently or negatively, possibly if they have dark skin or they have, you know, maybe they're Spanish speakers, or maybe they have a physical disability or a mental disability.
Okay, and that leads into our next question. What are the warning signs of possible discrimination?
And that's such a great question, Scott. I appreciate that you wanted to talk about it, because my response was there's so many. But what I think makes sense is to really look at what are our steps of how do we find housing? Let's pretend we're going on a housing search. And the first thing we're going to look for is advertisements, you know, openings. What are the properties that are available that are offering housing that meets my needs? And right off the bat, we see discriminatory advertising. For one thing, we'll see a lot of housing communities only show white residents, so there's no racial or ethnic diversity. Very few communities will actually show residents or human models that are supposed to represent residents. It could be stock photos, but the idea is these are the people who live here. Very few will show people using adaptive equipment like roller-rators, walkers, canes, or wheelchairs. There's kind of a perception of we're a very active community here. It's fun to live here. You're going to fit right in and have fun. And it's not very inclusive in terms of representing people realistically who might use that type of equipment or come from different parts of the world.
And
Yeah.
not to go too far off subject, but
Sure.
I just read an article where the Nielsen ratings did research on, you know, the image of disabilities on TV in relation to advertising,
Oh,
and it was like 1%.
mm-hmm.
So it's the same kind of thing.
Right. We would evaluate, you know, if we were looking at a particular property, we would look at every piece of published material and anything they offered online. So typically, especially with senior housing, there's a lot of marketing focuses on creating that sense of home and community, because they want people to feel comfortable and feel like they belong and that this is a safe choice that meets their needs. And that's certainly understandable in terms of wanting to make people feel welcome. The challenge is when they're only making certain people feel welcome. So we would look at, for example, one property would have over 100 opportunities of pictures being shown. So there's certainly room to incorporate diversity in when you have 100 pictures shown across your entire, you know, marketing campaign. But the choice is often not to be inclusive. I think some of it is unintentional, or, you know, sometimes we'll hear from senior housing providers, well, we just don't have any diversity. Well, you know, if you make an effort to present yourselves as inclusive, that might change. You know, the marketing, you know, can be very directly interpreted as who you're trying to attract. And if it's not inclusive, then people are going to look at that and feel like, well, they don't want me there. I use a walker. I don't see anybody represented who looks like me. So I'm not interested in pursuing that. However, senior housing and housing that offers, you know, healthcare services can be very limited in terms of availability. It can also be pretty expensive. So it's really important, right, that all of those opportunities are fully available to any senior, because those are really challenging hurdles to overcome anyway.
Therefore, do as the organization, do you guys go out and talk to housing providers and try to emphasize to them the perspective they are demonstrating from the other side of the fence, so to speak?
Yes, I appreciate that perspective, and we do. Some of the things that were funded under the senior millage to do include trainings, one for housing providers, where we talk about some of the warning signs, and I have more to share. And we also offer training for senior advocates or training of groups of older adults, 60 and older. We want to give them the information directly. So if and when they're ready to think about relocating, they have the information to recognize what housing discrimination for older adults looks like. Something else that we see is kind of screening in terms of, well, we'd really like to meet you in person. And sometimes why they're asked to come in is so that the property can assess how quickly are they moving, how independent are they communicating well with us? Kind of, it's a hidden health assessment, essentially, when they ask you to come in person. And it's really for independent living communities, they don't have the right to screen applicants based on health. But that's a really big issue that we see. And we'll see it for younger people with disabilities as well, that attitude that, you know, I don't think this is going to be a successful living situation for you. Well, the property doesn't get to make that decision. The person with the disability gets to make that decision. So we see that.
In a sense, they are basically taking inventory of the prospective consumer that's going to move into the area.
Mm-hmm. Yes, if there's a requirement that you need to be seen in person, that could be a red flag. Why, especially now when so many industries have successfully switched to using the type of technology that we're taking advantage of today, you know, why does somebody need to be there in person? That raises a question mark for fair housing advocates like us, and we would want to know why. We see a lot of this also on the actual applications, collections of a lot of information that have nothing to do with whether they can afford to live there and whether they qualify as a housing resident. You know, they'll collect faith-based information, health-based information. Sometimes they'll ask for completion of a form by a medical professional in order to access housing. And again, that's not what a housing provider is doing. If they're simply providing independent living, then they are just housing people as tenants, and they don't have the right to do that assessment of health or medical conditions. So those are possible warning signs of discrimination for older adults.
Okay. For our next question, what kinds of discrimination has Fair Housing Center experienced based on the race of older adults?
This is something that we see a little bit both in terms of kind of that screening, and then actually once older adults have moved into properties, there's a couple of cases I want to talk about. One situation was where an African-American woman was looking for housing for herself and her husband. So she started with the senior housing community in her neighborhood. She wanted to stay close to where she and her husband had raised their family. They knew the roads, they knew people in the neighborhood, they knew the local stores. It was very familiar. So in the back of her mind, she was always thinking, that's, you know, my next place. That's where I would like to live out the rest of my life. So when she went to visit, she was really surprised when the person who was working at the front office told her, quite frankly, we don't have a lot of people like you here, meaning we don't have a lot of Black residents. And then I think that staff person kind of panicked a little bit because she said that out loud and tried to backpedal. And she said, you know, everyone is welcome to live here, but we just want to make sure that you would feel comfortable. So she essentially pointed out the race of the applicant and then said, I'm not sure if he would be comfortable here. So she created that tension. And the woman really then began to doubt. First of all, she was really uncomfortable that was part of her greeting. And then she really began to doubt whether or not she wanted to go ahead and try to live there. So that type of thing is pretty common, that assessment of, there's not a lot of people like you, or maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else. That lack of welcome or that discouragement is a real problem with race-based discrimination. And then other examples are when people have moved in, they've experienced bullying because they're gay, because they're Black, because they speak with an accent. We've had kind of a pattern of people, older adults, who have experienced really negative treatment once they've accessed the housing. And if the goal of the harassment is really to push people back out of the housing, that probably is a fair housing issue that we could help with. One example made the local news a number of years ago. A Black woman moved into a senior community, and somebody literally wrote a racial slur on her door of her apartment, and they wrote the word move underneath. So that message was very clearly, we don't want you here. And upon investigating that, she shared other incidences, like when she would sit down at a table in the dining room to have a meal, people would get up and walk away, or people would whisper and say really negative things, knowing she could hear them. So that type of treatment is certainly a red flag as well.
Yeah, the question that comes to my mind is the first case you talked about. I would be very interested to know what the demographics were like in that area, if it was predominantly African American and the housing owners said your type might not feel comfortable here. That definitely makes you wonder if they were doing that all along, depending what the
Sure.
given area demographics were.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, you look at neighborhood demographics and then also the demographics of who's been able to access the housing, right? So all of those can play a role in kind of who gets preferential treatment or who gets welcomed, so to speak, and who isn't taken seriously as a potential resident, or even allowed sometimes to apply. So we certainly see differences in treatment. When we do our investigations, what we call testing, we send out 2 trained volunteers, and we've done a lot of that for the senior housing programs. We would send out a white senior and a Black senior, and the white senior would get a full tour and follow-up phone calls and a package of cookies and an invitation to come spend the night. And the Black tester would get none of that. They were given the basic information and maybe shown a unit, but the message of who is welcome and who's preferred and who would really be taken seriously as an applicant was very different based on those 2 volunteers' experiences. So we literally will, look at those 2 experiences side by side, and you can recognize that it can go very differently based on your race or skin color, or indeed if you have a disability.
Yeah, you would think we were moving forward, but it seems to be these same issues, come up time and time again.
Yes. And again, I appreciate the time with you and your viewers talking about this, because I think many people, myself included until I did this work, felt like there's laws that have been passed. We've addressed this. We've moved past this. But we've had a very busy caseload, even in the pandemic when people weren't trying to move around as much or couldn't really move anywhere. We're still having fair housing cases being filed with us, all year long, all year round. So the discrimination is definitely still happening in spite of the laws.
Okay. What can people do if they felt discriminated?
That's a fantastic question, and it's one where I'm grateful to say we are here to help you. We are funded to help people assert their fair housing rights. So if you are an older adult or any other individual looking for housing and you feel like you were treated differently because of your race, religion, whether you have children, whether you have a disability, those things that are protected, the Fair Housing Center can be an advocate for you and help research what happened, look for evidence of discrimination, and then we really equip our clients with choices. You know, it's up to them of what they would like to do. If they want to file with use an attorney and go to court, we would refer them to an attorney. We don't have attorneys on staff. We can't give legal advice, but that allows for us to be grassroots advocates that walk along with people to help them. Sometimes they want to move in. Maybe that housing isn't, you know, the only thing they can afford that's available. Maybe it's near their job, near their healthcare, near their family. You know, people have the right to choose. So if they want to still pursue the housing and it's available, we will advocate for that to happen. If they're already in their housing and something has happened, then we can try to help address, you know, the bullying or take steps to make sure that that individual feels safe in their housing if they've been treated differently. So the process can look different based on what's happening, but our services are free. We can investigate, we can help educate the clients about what their options are. If they want to file a complaint with the local or state or federal government, we can help them do that. We can help them mediate, we can advocate for change, especially for seniors with disabilities. The biggest type of discrimination we see is kind of the refusal to make accommodations and modifications, which is something we talked about in our first chat, but briefly here, that would be, you know, if you need changes to your bathroom, if you need grab bars or a tub cut in the bathroom because you need a different way to access the tub because of a disability, we can advocate for those changes. If you want an emotional support animal that's been prescribed by a healthcare provider, we can advocate for you to have permission to have an emotional support animal. So that type of change is, you know, something that we can help advocate for.
Okay. What are some of the fair housing issues seniors face when they try to move into senior housing and independent living for older adults?
Specifically with independent living for older adults, that means that the provider is only offering housing. There's no transportation, there's no health services, there's no care given. It's only for housing. That's all they do. But what we tend to see, and there's been some really big fair housing cases across the country, is we tend to see those types of housing providers looking at health records, medical records, assessing, you know, the ability for somebody to live independently when they don't have the right to do that. So that's something that we've seen some really big cases and decisions nationally where people have been held accountable to the tunes of thousands of dollars. So we're trying to get the word out to say, if you're offering independent living for older adults, all you need to do is assess them as a tenant. You know, you don't get to assess their mental health, their physical health as part of your process. That's not allowed. Now, if you're moving into housing that offers graduated levels of care, that can operate a little bit differently. But even then, it's very limited information that they're allowed to collect related to health. If it's housing with health-based services, then it's a little bit more of an opportunity to find out what services that individual needs, because you're getting both. You're getting health and housing. If you're only looking at housing, though, your health shouldn't be taken into consideration. Sometimes we also see housing providers offering independent living, looking at tenants who have been there for a while and saying, you know, maybe you should move somewhere else. Maybe this isn't the right fit for you. They've literally, you know, decided this isn't a good fit because of your health, or your health has changed, so we think you should move on. They do not have the ability to push people out. They need to allow services that will help that person to come in to the independent living.
Because they're health may start decline or whatever.
Absolutely. It changes
Okay.
as we age. And that's going to happen to all of us. And so, you don't want to lose your housing simply because you've maybe started to work with some of the great programs. Maybe you've got somebody helping with meals and medication 1 or 2 times a day. If you're in independent living, those caregivers should be allowed to come and go, as needed. But sometimes what we'll see is housing providers saying, you need that extra help. We don't think you should live here anymore. When actually bringing in that caregiver continues their ability to live there safely and good health and having the services that they need. So it can be a different perspective that we can advocate for that access to have the services brought in where you are.
Okay. What kinds of protections are there for older adults with disabilities?
So this is an area where we do see a lot of issues, specifically for older adults that have requested accommodations and modifications. Like I said, in 2020, we had 100 cases of disability-based discrimination, and most of those were housing providers really not understanding how to serve people with disabilities. So they would deny permission to have an emotional support or assistance animal. They would deny requests to put in grab bars or maybe change, let's change the type of stove that's offered in the apartment. If you are seated in a wheelchair and the control panel for the stove is at the top and at the back across all 4 burners, it's not really a safe way to access using those controls. So
No.
swapping out to a different type of stove would be a simple modification that could make a huge difference in day-to-day life. We've encountered older adults who are not using entire rooms or not using their kitchen equipment because they were told, no, we're not going to make these changes for you. And so we can kind of help make the argument and make the request and educate the housing provider, that this is something that needs to happen so that this person can fully enjoy their housing. They're paying for the living space, including the kitchen. I can think of one client we had who was only using a toaster oven to prepare her meals because she couldn't access the controls on her stove and oven safely, and she knew that, so she stopped using it, but then really couldn't cook anymore. She was using a toaster oven, which the property didn't want her to be doing anyway. But they should have swapped out her stove for her or allowed her to do it. It depends on how the property is funded. That answers the question of who pays for those types of requests. But we can connect any older adult with disabilities to resources in the community. Disability Advocates of Kent County, the Area Agency on Aging, Home Repair Services. There's other groups that do ramps. So there's resources that hopefully we can connect people to help make sure that their housing meets their needs.
It just fascinates me how these housing providers, are not that open-minded, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
I would hope if I were in that position, I would want to try to accommodate much as possible instead of just no, don't bother, I'm not gonna do it.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to say we have some really good housing providers out there who work very hard and clearly care for their residents. It's a mixed bag. It's not all bad housing providers. And I think a lot of it comes from not knowing what to do. So it's extra work, maybe it's unfamiliar. They were never trained on this. They don't recognize that the law requires this. So that's why we at the Fair Housing Center, not only do we help clients, but we'll help the housing provider. We'll point them to the right law, we'll point them to sample policies, guidebooks, resources on how to do this. because we want both parties to succeed, you know. So we try to work with anyone who's looking to further fair housing. And so we do offer that education from both points of view.
Since seniors can be more vulnerable, what kind of resources are available for them?
Really happy to say in Kent County, we have our senior millage. It's going to be up for renewal soon, so that you'll see a lot of community conversation and maybe some yard signs saying, let's renew this
Is
millage.
that 2022?
Yes, yes.
That's going to
So,
be on the ballot, I assume, in the fall.
yes,
Okay.
yes. So what those dollars go towards from Kent County taxes is a really amazing menu of services for older adults 60 and older living in Kent County. There's a 12-page guide on all the services that are funded, help with transportation, meals, socializing, housing repair, fair housing, of course, is on there, all kinds of healthcare services, groups that are helping watch to make sure that older adults aren't getting exploited. It's a really phenomenal program, and it's administered by the Area Agency on Aging of Western Michigan. So I'll send you that link, Scott, so we can include it in the conversation for people who might be looking for resources for 60 and older adults in Kent County. Not every community has these, and so we're very fortunate to have the dollars and the programs that help really, I think, do a lot of wonderful things for our older adults.
That leads me to my follow-up question is, since we might have viewers outside our area, I was just very curious, what similar programs do we have around the country or Michigan for that matter?
There are other area agencies on aging across Michigan. The state is divided up into service areas, and I'm not as well versed in the national movement, but I know there is a lot of networks looking to protect older adults, because there's a lot of, unfortunately, bad behavior where folks are trying to take advantage of older adults. So I would recommend looking for an area agency on aging in your community, and we'll follow up with information about the statewide groups.
And I would hope they could assist older individuals that might be looking to be a snowbird per se, go to Florida, Arizona, or what have you. What kind of resources might be in that given area?
Absolutely. That's something I have personal experience with. I was able to take a final trip with my mom, who was using oxygen and typically a rollerator is what we called it, a rolling walker that had a bench. So we were able to fly with some of that equipment, but when we got down to Florida, we had to borrow like a bathing chair, a shower chair. And there was a local agency, like one of the ones that I'm talking about, that had a lending closet. So they loaned out that type of equipment for people who were, not year-round residents and just needed it on a short-term basis. So, that network does exist, and it can make a huge difference in just being able to enjoy some of the things in life, like traveling to see relatives for a little while.
Oh, okay. I think that about wraps it up. Thank you once again for coming today.
Thank you so much. I always enjoyed talking with you. I feel like this is such an honor to be included in your program. Thank you.